All right, good morning, everyone. My name is John Suffern. I am a senior director here with Dido. Dido is a Google Premier partner based in Reston, Virginia, but have employees throughout North America. One of our employees is with us today to help us navigate the compliance journey, which can be very, I don't want to say difficult, but it can be a very overwhelming subject for a lot of organizations to try to tackle, as they believe that there are many obstacles when really they're just guideposts, and they're really to help you along your journey. And we have the experts here today with Kevin McGrail, who will introduce himself in a minute, that will be able to help you understand kind of where those guideposts should be and what kind of structure you need within your organization to move along this journey. So having said that, I will go ahead and let Kevin introduce himself and move along with the presentation.
Yes, thanks so much, John. It's really a pleasure to be here because I get asked a lot about compliance. It's one of the projects that I do almost constantly here. I helped found and lead our cybersecurity division, and we handle all different types of compliance from smaller things like PCI-DSS to authorizations to operate for federal agencies. So with that said, just a little bit about me. I do go by my initials, which are CAM. By the way, many people ask me, that is not Photoshop. That is not AI. That is a real can of off-brand Canadian spam. I work a lot in the email security world. So the fact that there's a can of spam that with my initials on it and how I go for my sobriquet is just very fitting. But as you can see here, I do a lot with Google. I do a lot in the open source community. Also proud to be a U.S. Marine Corps Cyber Auxiliarist. Find me on LinkedIn, ask me questions, love chatting and meeting people. But without further ado, let's talk about the compliance journey, because compliance is something that's, it's kind of maybe a sub word for security. Generally most compliance security frameworks are moving the needle on cybersecurity is their main reason for compliance. Sometimes there's other things, but what I've done is I've looked at how people go through the compliance journey, and what we've done is we've set out kind of 12 steps that we usually see that people end up on the compliance journey. So the first one really is kind of where does it start? What I call the predicate, and usually it's either something like an incident, unfortunately, or it's some sort of regulatory framework that has to be followed. So, understanding why you have to meet this guideline is very important. If it's, something where your board has said to meet it, or people have said that you need to do it for XYZ reason, a lot of times we get involved and find out people don't need to do it. That happens a lot, especially I know we're going to talk about ITAR and EAR. Just a little bit. That's one where, like, for example, unless there's a reason you have to do it, you generally avoid it. Additionally, then you have risk acceptance. And what this has to do with is what's the level of risk that your company will accept? Risk is never at zero. And so, what do you have to mitigate? What will give you that kind of sleep well at night factor and get it down to the lowest risk that you can accept? Number three, I call it stay in your lane, but it's really about knowing your boundary. Boundary is kind of a difficult concept for a lot of people to understand, but it has to do with defining what you're protecting. At a company, that could be protecting just one division. It could be protecting one product. It could be protecting the entire company. But, when you define what's inside your boundary and outside your boundary is very important. Things like contractors and subcontractors and third-party vendors, are they included in your boundary? Do you need to extend your compliance journey to include them? These type of questions are very important, and very early on, you want to kind of set what is inside that boundary, because it's sort of like setting the scope of a project. You don't want it to be too big. You don't want it to be unmanageable. You might have to break it into multiple projects if it is too big. But at the same time, you want to know what you're protecting very clearly. And then after you've defined that boundary, you get to the baseline. Baseline for us is extremely important. That's, for example, in an 853 program, we actually call it baselining your controls, is a very common phrase. But in this one, we're really just talking about where are you at? What's your compliance journey look like? It might be measured by controls. It might be measured by something like a C2M2 based system, something that just measures where you're at today. Then you know your goal and you can measure your progress and get an idea of what's going on. Think about it kind of like key performance indicators or KPIs. But with this, you know what you're trying to fix. The next thing you do is you take control, kind of a pun on the implementing controls. You start documenting what controls you have and implement solutions for them. So a control, for those who don't know, generally is just a requirement. Basically, it might say something like you have backups set up or your Wi-Fi is secure. Those are very simplistic. They get much, much more into the weeds and detailed. But you've got to go document, yes, we have backups. These are what's done. This is the organization, scheduled retention, et cetera. All of the details for backups. And there'll be controls and control enhancements in NIST as well that get done. Sorry, I didn't mean to go for it. But the next thing you have to do is evolve. And this is why many compliance journeys really need buy-in from the senior leadership, because you're kind of telling your company that you're going to meet this requirement. You're going to be compliant with this standard or these standards. And, you need to start evolving your company. Sometimes in the cybersecurity world, in the NIST world, what I generally say is that you need to start building a culture of cybersecurity. Everybody is on board, start making the operational changes, make sure you have staff understanding where the goal is going, and start making sure that they know they need to make changes to perhaps meet controls. Because a lot of times when we're talking about compliance, it comes under three pillars. It comes under the technical, it comes under the business, and it comes under the security. And, a lot of times companies aren't thinking about the fact that compliance might involve business changes. For example, many projects that are on FedRAMP High, you can only use staff that is both a US citizen as well as located inside the continental United States. That might require hiring changes, that might require staffing shuffles, et cetera, to meet those type of requirements. So now you've started to get your controls, you've started to make the organizational changes towards this. The next step is an audit. And many of these steps, as you might imagine, are reiterative. You might have to do a pen test, do controls, do more changes, et cetera, and keep reiterating on it. Cyber is never done. And that's definitely one of the isms we're going to have in the final slides. But, many of these things are reiterative. So with a pen test, it might be internal, it might be external. Sometimes it depends on the specific compliance framework that you're trying to work with. But, when you do that, it finds problems and then you come up with how to fix those problems. It's very rare, by the way, that a pen test fails. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that I tell customers when they hire us to do a pen test is that we have a very, very high success rate. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. What it has to do with is how does the penetration test succeed? I'll give you an example. Everything in pen tests is about rules of engagement. It's about what you're allowed to do. And it should be matching what your risk factors are that you talked about earlier on. Let's say you have a company and you say, I don't want a file cabinet hacked. Okay. So now we know we're protecting a file cabinet, our boundaries, that, et cetera. So we can build a room, we can add security, we can hire guards, et cetera, to protect that room. But if my pen test says, I'm allowed to bribe employees and I come in with a nice $50,000 stack of cash and say, hey, I just need to get in that file cabinet. And the person says, sure. That is a legitimate risk at some companies where we actually have to look at whether or not they have staffing risks, whether or not they have insider threats and things like that. Most people don't think evil. They don't think like this. But that's what a pen test can go to. It can go both to physical, it can go to social engineering, it can go to technical and security, and it can be done in multiple different ways. Some of them are called white box, black box, gray box, but it just has to do with how much knowledge you have about the company. So for example, if I know everything about the system and I'm trying to hack it, that could be like, for example, emulating an insider threat. That's one way. If it's a black box where it's like, I know nothing, the only things I can find on the internet about your company, et cetera, that's more of a black box. Then you have the middle ground in the gray box and everything in between. Sometimes your compliance framework is going to give you an idea of what you need to do for the pen test, but your risk acceptance is really going to drive that, along with your knowledge of your industry, what's a risk, perhaps a threat assessment, figure out what's toxic at your company if it was to leak. or be compromised, what would it do? Would it be an existential threat to the company, or would it be no big deal? You know, we talked a little bit about that with the CIA triad a little bit later on. But after you've done that pen test, you're going to do an internal or an external audit. Again, some of these you might start with an internal, and then once you feel that you've gotten to the standpoint that you hire an external expert to come in and do your audit, that's where you do that. Many of your frameworks, CMMC and NIST, have levels where you have to have an external auditor, often called a third-party audit organization, or a 3PAO is how we pronounce that, 3PAO, et cetera. And they basically confirm you've met the controls. They read the pen test, they look at what's going on, and they basically say whether or not you're in a good situation or what you need to remediate, which immediately leads us to step number 9. And this is where you kind of do your post-audit remediation. If you believe you've gotten the remediation to a point where you are have mitigated the risks, everything, for example, in this to a low risk, you might then seek your authority to operate, or your ATO. And, you know, this doesn't mean you're in perfection. You know, perfection is oftentimes not achievable, but that you have either compensatory measures in place to protect for controls that might not be 100%, or you're aware of the controls that need to be met, and you have plans for them. And that's really what leads to step 11, which is the gap closure. So it's very normal to have gaps in a system. What's good is you want to know them. Anybody who's military here knows that unknowns are normal, but unknown unknowns are bad. So you want to have an idea of where your gaps are at, have them documented, and have a rough plan and time frame when they're going to be closed, and reiterate on those gaps and get them closed. And then finally, the step that's in place for every cybersecurity and compliance program is going to be that continuous monitoring. That's where you're going to be looking at the system, figuring out what's going on, and continuously doing all of these steps in a reiterative fashion, because tomorrow there might be a new exploit and you've got to start over. Perhaps you make a lot of changes and upgrades to a particular system that you got your ATO on, and now you have to reauthorize the system. Very normal over the life cycle of a compliance or security framework. So these 12 steps really kind of get you an idea of what's going on. From a money standpoint, you can see that sometimes compliance can be very expensive. A lot of times you want people that enjoy it and enjoy the challenge of just working on something over and over again. I usually make the joke, for example, like if you're hiring an accountant, that you want somebody to take special joy in reconciling an account with no errors in 3 minutes or less. It takes all different types to make the world go round. And compliance is one of those things that you want to look for a personality that really enjoys it. It oftentimes is not somebody that you already have at your company when you start doing risk compliance and security work. All right, so I want to give some thoughts about those cybersecurity frameworks, these compliance frameworks, talk about something called crosswalking, and then also a little bit about the culture. So there's really 3 categories we're going to talk today about cybersecurity frameworks. I've got them on the left, starting with PCI-DSS and SOC2. These are what I consider to be more of the commercial and more simplistic cybersecurity and compliance requirements. In the middle, we have kind of the federal requirements. The NIST Special Publication 853 is the granddaddy of almost all the cybersecurity frameworks out there, a little over 20 years old and amazingly well written. FedRAMP just recently became a law in last year of June, but it's been around for about 10 years. It's sort of a way of implementing a previous Federal Information Security Act called FISMA. That was a law, and it's a way of doing it in a way that's more general so it can be shared among different agencies and organizations. Recently, the NIST 853 did change to Rev 5, and in Rev 5, it dropped basically a word from the title to mean that it's about protecting organization systems. It isn't just about protecting federal information. So it's a great framework at many companies. And then on the right-hand side, we kind of get into the DoD, Department of Defense, and those type of frameworks, cybersecurity frameworks, such as the 800-171 from NIST. NIST, by the way, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They published some great papers around cybersecurity and really have been responsible for many decades for doing so. This might switch over to another agency that's now responsible for security called CISA, but for now it's with NIST, and NIST has done a fabulous job with these documents. They go through wonderful peer review, and they're very generic. For example, in legal terms, we would talk about the fact that they are about the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. So you have to meet the spirit of the control, not just be able to check a box on the letter of the law. The 800-171 is about controlled unclassified information that you might see if you're working with the DoD or in the defense industrial base. CMMC is also a framework that is to be required soon by the defense industrial base when working with the DoD. It largely builds on the federal acquisition requirements, as well as the 800-171 is the key thing. So make sure you're protecting the data, and it starts at all levels of everybody working for the DoD. And then finally, you have ITAR and ITAR. These largely have to do with things that are perhaps should not fall into the hands of people without a that aren't a U.S. citizen or shouldn't be allowed to leave the United States. ITAR, for example, is the export arms regulations, I think is what that stands for. But arms isn't just about firearms and kinetic weapons. It can also involve software and things like that that can't leave the United States or leave to certain countries, et cetera. So those are the main frameworks. One of the ones, if you're not familiar or you don't know which one you're doing, that I often recommend companies start with that can give them a great basis in cybersecurity is the PCI-DSS. The PCI-DSS is the Payment Card Industry Data Security Specifications. And this is really kind of a bad compliance framework. The reason I say that is because the reason it exists is so that companies like Visa and MasterCard can shift the blame and the responsibility for cybersecurity over to their merchants. So, for example, I find it very silly that credit cards in the US have taken so long to do chip. We still don't do PIN, and we let our credit cards go out of our eyesight. In Europe, I don't know how long, close to a decade at least, they've used the chip, they require a PIN, and they always bring the credit card to you. So your credit card is right there in front of you. You put it into the machine, you handle it the whole time. If you think about it in the US, your credit card goes with your server or your waitress or whatever at a restaurant. It's out of your sight. You've now lost control of it. It doesn't mean that's perfect security. I mean, you still have things like skimmers and things like that can be installed, but the problem here is just that it's all about shifting blame and shifting the responsibility. It's also done in a way that I can't remember if I've got a slide about it, but it's self-assessed, and I think we'll talk about that later, and the pros and cons of a self-assessed document. SOC2, again, these are generally your commercial. SOC2 is about do you have the right processes for your system? It's actually done by AICPA, so it's more of a bean counter concept. It's from the accounting standpoint. You have two different types. You have type 1 and a type 2. That has to do with whether or not it's a snapshot in time or if it's a continuous audit that happens over and over again to make sure that your compliance is staying compliant. As I mentioned with NIST, the framework there, that's generally more in the federal space, but many corporations follow NIST. It is definitely the best framework out there for most people's uses. And then if you're in the DoD space, you're going to know about the 800-171 and similar types of frameworks as well. So that's some thoughts about it. When you're dealing with these frameworks, one of the things I do like to mention, especially for corporations, is the concept of crosswalking. So crosswalking is really just the idea of many companies have to meet more than one framework. So is there a way to cross-correlate certain controls in one framework to another? And the answer is yes. There are numerous spreadsheets out there. There are companies that exist just to do this, like Ostendio. And the main thing here is that crosswalking can make your job easier because you meet a control, you document it, and then you might reuse that controls documentation in multiple cases and maintain it in one place so that you don't have to keep revisiting the wheel. You don't have different teams doing it different ways, et cetera. Building a cyber culture, the reason this is so important is because probably the number one reason that I see compliance fail is because they don't have ownership and they don't let the company know that they're going for this particular type of compliance. And so people don't really pay enough attention. And what I find is that if we can do things like set up a program, set up the training, make sure that everybody in the company is part of the cybersecurity. They start to get proud of the fact that they work at a company that's secure. They start to be proud of the fact that they can shut down the bad actors. But you don't want a weak link in this whole system. And as I mentioned, cybersecurity is multiple pillars on technical, business, and cyber. It isn't just about the software and the firewalls. It really does start with the training and the people that are there. So make sure you're building that culture of cybersecurity, doing your training, and getting people involved and making sure they know what your goals are for a compliance standpoint. So some of the foundations that you need for that culture of cyber that I talk about is you have to really understand what are the risks of your environment in your industry. That has to do with how likely are you to be hacked? For example, banks have been robbed since the day they've been started. So they're very generally good on understanding risks. They, in recent years, haven't been as good as understanding the cyber risks because they've been experts in the physical risks with, security guards and vaults and things like that to stop theft. But, now they've got to evolve to digital theft and things like that. But you have to understand your environment. You have to understand your industry. You have to know the risks that might be there. And you have to make sure that you're constantly learning there. The next thing you have to do is you have to provide that governance to your employees and your customers. Let them know what you're doing, how you're stopping these things, training, documentation, keeping it simple. There's a lot of things that can be taught here, but the main point is you're doing that governance. As I mentioned before, make cyber everyone's responsibility, make them proud, develop training, and understand dissemination. So, for example, in most cybersecurity frameworks, they require that things are disseminated. And a lot of companies fail on this. They write policy, they create procedures, and they put them in a folder somewhere and no one ever looks at them. That is not sufficient. Most of the time it says that they have to be disseminated, they have to be updated, they have to be trained on anytime there's a kind of a relevant risk or relevant change to a system. Which could be, something you have to debate internally. A lot of brainstorming happens in compliance and cybersecurity about whether or not something is at this point, a lot of documentation. But you have to make sure that you're disseminating it out to your customers, to your employees, so that those policies and those procedures and those controls that you're implementing are followed through and handled. Other than that, I will tell you, we talked a little bit about monies. For example, a FedRAMP high project could be 18 months and generally about 10,000 hours of work. So you're talking about several $million of work. Something like a SOC 2 can be done in a couple of months and might cost $50,000 to $100,000, including the audit, things like that. But most of these are very much about the slow and steady wins the race. They're not done anytime soon. They typically have ongoing requirements. And you want to make sure that things are documented, that you're not just rushing through things, and that you're moving the cyber needle. All right. So as I promised, I do have a section here about auditing versus self-assessments. And, when we're talking about auditing versus self-assessments, we have both the pros and the cons. So let's talk about the self-assessment. So PCI-DSS, for example, as well as CMMC, probably at levels 1 and 2, will be a self-assessment, meaning that you go through a checklist, you go through a questionnaire, and you check off whether or not you've met the controls. Now, the pro there is that you don't have to pay somebody to do that work. The con is that most people don't have the expertise to answer the questions correctly. I often bring up the wireless or the Wi-Fi, like the wireless internet requirements under PCI-DSS, typically say something like, for example, are you using secure wireless? And people are like, yes, we're using secure wireless. But then when you read into it and go into the devil's in the details, you read in there, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's like, are you using 802.11i certificates? And you ask the people, like, are you using an 802.11i certificate? And they go, what's an 802.11i certificate? At which point, you know that they're not really using secure Wi-Fi. So a lot of companies, when they're doing PCI-DSS, which is required for most companies taking credit cards, we get rid of all wireless in the infrastructure. That's an easy way to meet that control. But as I talked about, that can be expensive. That can require re-architecting things. It might require running physical wiring throughout a store or a business, et cetera. So it can lead to some changes. But you sometimes need experts to come in and say, what's the low-hanging fruit? I don't do a lot with sales on this call, don't worry. But like, for example, at Dido, we do a thing called a quick cybersecurity assessment, because most of the time you don't need to hire our team for a $50,000 assessment and for us to make you a 200-page report, because you're probably not going to know what to do with a 200-page report. And it just is too much for most companies. Hire us instead for a $10,000 engagement. We come back, we give like the top 10 things that need to be done. And we do that in just a week or two. And we give real world changes that need to be made. These type of things can really help when you're doing these type of self-assessments and whatnot, because, obviously, as you get into the more serious compliance and cybersecurity frameworks, they are going to require external auditors. And there's a whole art to how you deal with external auditing and whatnot. So pros and cons on both. Even if you have a self-assessment requirement, don't hesitate to get an external auditor to do it, just because most companies don't have the expertise to do it correctly. And with PCI-DSS, for example, the credit card companies are going to look for any excuse for why they don't have to be responsible for a hack. They will instead charge you for when you get hacked, and they have to fix the problem. If you think about some, like say your credit card machines get hacked and they have to reissue, 5,000 credit cards, they will bill you $7 a credit card times 10. So they'll give you a bill for $70,000 if you didn't fully comply with PCI-DSS. And if you do as a self-assessment, you might not have fully complied with it, or you might have answered yes on something that's no. As I mentioned, one of the biggest ones that I see all the time is they say they're using secure Wi-Fi. You come in, it's not secure. That's what ended up getting them hacked, and it goes there. Anyway, don't want to scare people about it, but like I said, it's about risk acceptance. Sometimes it's about risk shifting and whatnot. But that does lead to the concept of ongoing versus snapshot audits. So in SOC 2, for example, a snapshot would be the type 1. That means that they take all of your information, they look at it, and they give you a certification that as of this day and time, your systems met it. The problem is that systems change, and they change rapidly. You don't know if tomorrow a new software is installed, a new hardware was bought, new network design was done, new office was moved into. So usually for any real cybersecurity or compliance framework, you're going to be looking at an ongoing, again, SOC 2, it's a type 2 type of audit. That means you have continuous monitoring, and you're constantly reiterating through those 12 steps that we talked about. Usually we look for a slow and steady approach, things like quarterly, semi-annual and annually type of meeting, going over all the steps of a process and just continuously doing it, because by staying on top of it, you don't end up with a lot of homework and you don't end up with gaps, because unfortunately what happens is a lot of people think they're secure, they get hacked, and then we go back and find out that they really haven't updated or done an audit in 5 years, for example. So time flies. Think about ongoing audits is probably the main thing there. But the last thing, and I unfortunately do have to, say that these are, Didoisms, CAMisms. These are the things that people that hire us get really kind of tired of seeing and hearing all the time when we're on engagements. But, some of these you probably haven't heard, so I hope you'll give me a moment of time about it. So the first thing is, when I'm talking about almost any cybersecurity project, the question that I can ask that isn't answerable is, when is cybersecurity done? The answer, it's never done. So what I normally do is I do a type of approach to projects that is what we call time boxing. Most companies do not have unlimited resources, both money and staff. So we usually look at what's the goal, what's the time frame, and what's the budget. And then we put together how we're going to attack that problem to meet those goals in that time frame and try and stay within that budget. That usually is a really good way to approach it. That lets us do time boxing, because a lot of times in cyber there's diminishing returns. We might spend 8 hours on something and get to the 90% mark, and it's going to take another 80 hours to get to that next 10% done. We may decide that, okay, we're just going to spend 12 hours on it, and we're going to accept the risk that we've only achieved about 90% of our gap closure, because we don't have infinite resources. And again, it's an ongoing, continuous process. So we're going to continue working on it. We're going to continue trying to close that gap. The other one that I like using came out of Dr. Saraswati. She's at UVA's School of Business, Darden School. And she has a thing that really formalized a lot of how I work over the last few decades. She's called effectuation theory. Effectuation theory is kind of the opposite of causation theory. And the really simple example that she gives is that causation, what you do there is you identify a goal and then you line up the resources to achieve that goal. If you're a causation chef, that would mean you're going to decide to make a chicken pot pie. So you're going to go to the store and you're going to buy a pie pan, you're going to buy chicken, you're going to buy vegetables, you're going to buy stuff to make the crust, etc. You buy all the stuff that's needed and you go back and make it. A effectuation theory does more of an assessment of resources, and then it looks at what goals you can achieve with the resources you have. So that would be like looking in the pantry, looking in the fridge, and figuring out what you can make with what you already have. So going back to the cooking illusion, like the Caesar salad is actually named for a guy named Caesar who was stuck in a hotel, I believe, and only had like a piece of hard romaine, some fish, and romaine lettuce, and and some stale bread. So lo and behold, the famous Caesar salad was born, and that would be a very, very clear example of effectuation theory. Sometimes with a project such as cybersecurity, we're going to look at what resources do you have internally, how can we maximize them, and then we're going to look at things from the standpoint of augmenting. So we'll use both effectuation theory and causation theory. But if you just do causation theory and you're like, okay, I'm going to hire 5 people to do 10,000 hours over the next year, that could be a very, very expensive way to attack it. So that is the Kevinism number 1 and 2. Number 3 really is just that risk mitigation is about sleeping well at night. It cannot be a zero risk. You can't repeat this enough. You cannot get risk down to 0. It's about what are the biggest risks, how you're going to handle those, which risks have the biggest impact to your company, etc. So make sure you understand that. The next Kevinism really follows around a core of most cybersecurity programs, but not one that is well understood by a lot of people outside of cybersecurity, and that's the CIA triad. This has nothing to do with the Central Intelligence Agency. This has to do with doing system and business assessments, what we call impact assessments, for the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability, CIA, of a system. For example, every system needs to have an impact assessment, and normally either 1 or at most 2 of the CIA triad can apply to that system. For example, most websites are publicly available information. So the confidentiality is not important. It's public information. The integrity is very important. You don't want somebody defacing your website and putting dancing hamsters all over it. And then availability may depend on your company. So for example, most firms, a website, if it goes down for the weekend for maintenance and it's back up on Monday, probably isn't a big deal. So availability doesn't matter. Company, if you're Amazon and you lose millions of dollars worth of sales per hour that you're out, being out for a weekend could be a big deal. But each system has to be assessed and come up with what are the particular impact to your business, the impact assessment against the CIA. Understanding this will let you understand which things have the highest risk, which ones need to be protected, and how they need to be protected. Many times we come in and people are protecting things that don't need to be protected. The next ism that I have is, this comes back to zero trust analysis. John Kindervag did a wonderful job back in 2008, 2009, documenting these concepts. They've really been taking off in the last few years. But the idea is you don't trust anybody with anything. And the key part of a zero trust network or zero trust assessment is identifying what data, what systems you have, and then identifying the toxicity should they leak. A lot of times, for example, we find that people are protecting data like press releases. Well, you've already published them publicly. Why do they need to be protected? Now, if they're embargoed and they haven't been put out publicly, that's a different matter. But that's an example of something that, improper amount of protection. There's also kind of a, blasé a little bit, but, don't keep data you don't need to keep, because I don't have to do any security on data you don't have. So, if you have policies, one of the biggest things that we see when we're doing audits is that you need to follow your policies. And the destruction policy is probably one of the ones that isn't followed. For example, websites, a lot of times I read the privacy policy and the terms and conditions. And what I tell companies is that the policy just needs to say, what are you collecting? How are you storing it? Why are you collecting it? How are you using it? And how are you getting rid of it? And, a lot of times I go in there and people aren't documenting it correctly. or they're using it for manners that they haven't disclosed. So, a lot of times it's just actually documenting what you're doing as a business. For example, at our company, Document Retention, we start with what are we retaining today, both physically and electronically. Document that. Then look at what do you need to improve on it, get the operational changes in place to do that, and then update your policies and procedures to meet those requirements as they go along. So very reiterative and whatnot. But the key point that I've stated there is that it's reiterative. It starts with a process. And one of the biggest things that I often tell people is do not let perfection get in the way of progress. You don't have to be perfect. Start somewhere, start documenting, start moving. It's a slow and steady process. And identify your gaps, document them, and move them on. A lot of times I'm asked by people like, hey, I'm a developer. What would make me a senior developer? What would make me a cybersecurity developer? And what I normally tell them is it's normally not that hard. It's that you're looking for problems. You're thinking about how the bad actors will use those problems. You're writing those problems down. And then you're perhaps proving whether or not those problems can be exploited or not. That requires a very special level of expertise. You may not have permission to do that. And then finally, you're thinking about ways to fix it. If you can move into that from just, hey, I wrote this code and it does the job, or I implemented this computer system and it does the job, and you can add and it's secure, and here's how I secured it. That's generally where you're going to move into that cybersecurity type of role. Because many systems, it isn't about anybody can tell you like do this and it's secure. What normally happens is that spirit of the law that we talked about, and it's the next ism is something I call document and defend. You document how you're doing and you defend how it's secure. Doesn't mean somebody's not going to poke some holes in it later on. You have to be constantly brainstorming and thinking about it, but you've documented what you do and you've defended why it's secure. This is especially important if you stray away from, maybe doing something that is documented in a cybersecurity framework, but it doesn't make sense. With the NIST, for example, the 853, that framework was written. It's technology agnostic. It doesn't really care if you're on the cloud or on premise, even though it is for cloud service providers. It's really agnostic. And so you have to talk about how you're meeting that. If you're using Google Cloud, you've got to talk about what systems you're using to protect this and generally defend how it meets the control, whether that's explicitly or sometimes it's more obliquely and has to be explained for why this meets the control. And that kind of leads to my next ism, which is if I'm trying to insult somebody in the cybersecurity world, I will generally call them a checkbox assessor. All they care about is can they check the box. They don't necessarily care about did they check it, did they meet the spirit, do they actually move the needle, is the customer or the system actually secured. That's very important. Don't be a checkbox assessor. Think about why the control was written. These controls, these programs, they're not immutable. One of the things that I know sets us aside is the fact that we do not look at these cybersecurity frameworks like they're immutable. We're oftentimes talking to the authors and have authored them as well to talk to these organizations and improve these cybersecurity frameworks because they aren't perfect. They go through revisions. They go through years and years of public discussion and trying to make things bigger. And they're not always up to date with the latest hacks and things like that. So, you want to be keeping on top of specific things like the National Vulnerability Database and things like that if you're doing software implementations to make sure you're keeping on top of what might be a risk for your company. So all of that lets you move the cyber needle positively. And that's what you want to be seen doing. And many of these concepts, these isms, are what we reiterate sometimes ad nauseum during our engagements, but they're important because like I said, it takes a special type of person to be interested in doing these compliance frameworks, to be interested in doing cybersecurity, and to stay on top of it, not burn out. Some people have read my articles before, and so I'll leave you with one last of one of my guidelines, my isms is I start every cybersecurity meeting with a dad joke. The reason I do that is because, we're now going to talk about nothing but negativity for the next hour, sometimes dealing with the worst of the internet that's out there, the worst of society. And it can be draining. So a little dad joke, it isn't about not taking it seriously. It's just about bringing a little bit of levity to the situation. I will tell you my favorite one of last year. You have to be a Star Wars fan to get it, but the dad joke that I liked was, what's the internal temperature of a tauntaun? The answer is lukewarm. So I'll leave that to you to research why that's hilarious. And you can, I didn't write it. Somebody else did. I'm sorry, I don't know the original author. But, that's our final ism there. Other than that, I think there should be a thank you deck, but somehow I have lost my thank you slide. So, oh no, there it is. Just not working. Why are you not working thing? There we go. Finally works. So, we are available here. I'll hand it over to John to close us out. But thank you for your time and attention. If you're interested in compliance or cybersecurity journey, please reach out. Happy to give some free advice. Happy to talk to you about if you're having problems with your journey, what might help right the ship. Always interested in more work. Got kids to put through college and food on the table and whatnot. But overall, have done decades of volunteering in the industry as well. Just like helping people move the needle positively. So, back to you, John.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cam. Awesome presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for watching today's recorded video. As the email is right up there on the board, please feel free to reach out to Cam. It is the best resource you possibly could get in this field. So please do take advantage of the information that he might be able to provide to you. And again, thank you. Have a wonderful day. And we look forward to talking to you at some point in time in the future.